Well, I'm from the press. I'm here to help you. You know, I really enjoyed Mohammed El-Arian's talk, but the notion that he was somehow intimidated to be standing here before you didn't quite ring true. I'm kind of intimidated by being the halftime entertainment between Mohammed El-Arian in the morning and Tom Friedman at dinner. Talk about intimidating. And the other thing is, I can speak without notes, but I am not capable of wandering a stage and not falling down these stairs. And I thought that was the single most impressive thing that El-Arian did. Look, and then to make it even worse, I'm the guy who's supposed to explain to you the part of Mohammed's fourth point about Washington's dysfunction, right? He gets to tell you what a great job the Fed did. I can give that speech too. I get to tell you why it is that the rest of the government is not working. So let me start by talking a little bit about the budget. I think that we have a big problem in that most people, and I suspect even some people in this room, don't really understand the federal budget, and it's not surprising. Washington has adopted language that is designed to exclude the rest of us. Continuing resolution, appropriation, sequester. Has anybody ever used the sequester in ordinary conversation until the last few months? The second thing is, it's big. $3.6 trillion is more than most of us can get our heads around. Dave Barry, who's a humor columnist for the Miami Herald, once advised reporters like me to stop using the words millions, billions, and trillions because they sound so much alike. His advice to us was to use the words golf balls, watermelons, and hot air balloons to give people some idea of the dimensions. I've used that line a couple of times. I've actually thought about doing this in a column, but I don't actually have the guts to try it. I think the copy editors would kill me. So let me start with a couple of basic facts, because my case is this isn't really so complicated. There are lots of details, but the fundamentals are very, very easy to understand. The first fundamental is the federal deficit is not today's economic problem. Today's economic problem is unemployment, 7.7% unemployment, 12 million people out of work who say they're looking for work, 3 million of them have been out of work for a year or more and still tell the government that they're looking for work. 8 million people are working part-time, even though if they could find a full-time job, they would. The stock market is hitting new records almost every day. The federal government is borrowing money at 2%. 2%. Historic lows. The rest of the world can't find an alternative place to put its money. We're lucky that we can borrow at this low rate, at this time in our history when we need to borrow, when the public sector has borrowed more to cushion the deleveraging of the private sector. But the deficit is very much tomorrow's economic problem. The one measure of this, the debt to GDP, the publicly held debt to GDP, was about 35%. About a decade ago, it's now 75%. And the Congressional Budget Office tells us that if you take a realistic scenario of what current policy is, it'll be at 87% by the end of the decade. That's putting us at risk of another financial crisis. It denies us the flexibility that we need in case the government has to face a crisis by borrowing more. And of course, it means that someday somebody's going to have to pay higher taxes, probably our kids and our grandchildren. Now, the problem with those two facts, the deficit is not today's problem, the deficit is tomorrow's problem, is that Congress is incapable of holding those two ideas in its head at the same time. And that's really the root of the problem in Washington. The difficulty is that we can't wait to fix tomorrow's problem. Tomorrow's problem, as some of the charts you've seen before show us, is largely a problem of benefits, many of them to older people, a lot of them involving health care. When I came to Washington as a reporter in 1987, the cliche among the budget wonks was, we've got to do something about these benefit programs before the baby boom retires. 1987. Well, the oldest baby boomers are now 66. They're already eligible for Medicare and in most cases Social Security. And most of the plans that we talk about in Washington now about Medicare and Social Security protect people who are over age 55 from any benefit changes. 59% of the baby boom is already over age 59. So the longer we wait, the bigger cuts or tax increases we're going to have to make to equip the system for this, what has been called the silver tsunami. Now, I'm 58 years old, so I tend to look at this a lot differently than I did when I came to Washington in 1987. You know, Daniel Patrick Moynihan has famously said to have remarked when they finished the work of the Greenspan Social Security Commission, somebody asked him, what about the baby boom? And he said, you know, it's important to leave some problems for the next generation to solve. All right, so how do we think about the federal budget? The reason it's so hard to understand is because, as I said, it's big. When the OMB sends out to the agencies instructions on how to request money from the president's budget, it's nearly 1,000 pages. The instructions for putting a request from a government agency to OMB is 1,000 pages. The president's budget last year was 2,138 pages, and then each department sends Congress a justification. My favorite is the Department of Homeland Security. They sent Congress 3,131 pages explaining why they needed the money they were asking for, one page for every $12.6 million they wanted to spend. All right, I'm going to convince you that there are only 5 things you need to know about the federal budget, and I'm going to go over them quickly so I can live up to the SIEPR tradition of having everything be on time. I have never been to a conference where they could serve lunch in 45 minutes and get people right, so I give them a lot of credit for that. Fact 1, almost 2/3 of the federal budget is on autopilot. Money that goes out the door every year without an active vote of Congress. This is, of course, legal. It's keeping promises that were made in the past. Promises to pay benefits, promise to pay interest on the federal debt. Point 2, a big chunk of that is health care. In 1960, health care was less than 10% of all federal spending. Today, it's almost 25%. By the end of the decade, according to the Congressional Budget Office, which some people who spoke earlier might disagree with, it'll be at about 33% of the federal budget. We spend more than every other country per capita. We do not have the world's healthiest population. Now, Zeke told you that his goal is to get healthcare spending to GDP, the rate of GDP, GDP plus 0. But that's GDP plus 0 per capita. So as we have more people, and particularly as we have more old people, it's highly likely that healthcare will continue to grow as a share of the federal budget. After all, the federal government is actively deciding to cover more people, some of them elderly, some of them not, and we don't really know if the recent slowdown in healthcare costs will last. I hope it does. I'm with Zeke. I hope it does. I'm just not willing as a citizen to say, don't worry about this healthcare thing, because it's going to take care of itself. Now, Zeke didn't really say that, but what Mark pointed out is these current trends, which are very encouraging. Medicare Part A and Part B rose at only 3% a year for the last few years. For the 7 years before that, they rose at almost 9%. There has definitely been a slowdown. We don't know if it's lasting. The point is we have to find some way to have policies that make sure this trend continues, and it's not going to be easy. And personally, I'm not comforted by the fact that the doctors are all that stand between us and prosperity. That wasn't the most optimistic sentence in Zeke's talk. The third thing is you can't talk about the federal budget without talking about defense. Defense is 20% of federal spending, and here's a fact. The U.S. government spends more on defense than the next 17 countries combined. More than Germany, China, Russia, Israel, Egypt. I've never been able to memorize all 17 of them. We obviously need a strong defense. The Defense Secretary announced today we're moving some anti-missile units to Alaska in case the North Koreans are getting nuclear-armed missiles. We obviously have to protect against that. The danger from Chinese cyber hackers is no longer theoretical. It's here. I know this because they hacked the Wall Street Journal's computers. And you know something, we really know when there's a problem. It's when it affects us. That's why there's been so much stuff on hacking in all the major papers lately. Before it was just Cisco and Boeing and the CIA, but now it's getting serious. And I'm no defense expert. I'm not going to tell you how much defense do we need. But we have to decide, to what extent do we want to be the cops of the world? To what extent is our GDP, as a share of world GDP, goes down? Do we find other people to help carry the burden of protecting the sea lanes and policing against terrorism. And we have to make some choices there. And just like all of you believe there's a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse in government, well, I want to tell you something. It doesn't stop at the walls of the Pentagon. All right, fact 4. The federal government employs a lot of people. You've heard a lot of them lately. Every one of them is complaining about the sequester, each one in a different newspaper every day. More than 4 million people work for the federal government. We pay them a lot of money in wages and benefits. But it only comes to about $450 billion. Now, that may sound like a lot of money, and even out in Silicon Valley, that's a lot of money. But if we laid off every single federal employee, from the president's secretary to the woman who's taking tolls at Yellowstone today, if it's open, to the soldiers in Afghanistan, every one of them, wipe out their benefits and wipe out their wages, we wouldn't have cut the deficit even in half. We are not going to balance the budget. We are not going to put our government on a sustainable fiscal trajectory by getting rid of federal employees. Why is that? Because most of the money that the federal government takes in, it pays out again, and not to its employees. It's in benefits, Social Security, Medicare, veterans, farm price supports. It's in contracts to private companies, and it's in grants to state and local governments. If we are going to control spending, somebody is going to get less money from the federal government. I don't know about you, but I must have missed that point in the presidential debates where Mitt Romney and Barack Obama said somebody's going to get less money. Instead, what they did is Obama went to audiences like this. Well, maybe here he would have told you should pay more taxes. But generally, when he spoke to mass audiences, he said, we can do this, but we are not going to hurt your benefits. We're going to tax the rich. And Romney came almost as close to making the same argument. Somehow it was always somebody else who's going to feel the pain of deficit reduction. Well, it's not true. We're going to feel all of it, and it's not only going to be federal employees, although surely there are some of them who we could live without. And the fifth thing is taxes, and we could have, and there are people here more learned than me who could speak for a long time about the question of taxes and what's appropriate. But it seems to me that there are a couple of facts worth remembering. One is that for people at the middle of the middle class, that middle 20% of Americans, their tax rates have not gone up. They are paying less of their income in federal, I'm not talking about state and local, in federal taxes of all kinds, payroll, income, their share of the corporate income tax, everything, than they did in 1979. They paid about 19% of their income in federal taxes in 1979. Even before the Great Recession temporarily reduced thing, they were down to about 14.5. The federal government has managed to spend a hell of a lot more money without raising taxes on the middle class. And it didn't do it because we had a rapidly growing economy lately either, in case you haven't noticed. So how did they do that? Two things. One is people at the top paid more in taxes, in part because people on the top had a lot more of the money than they did in 1979. And secondly, we borrowed a lot. We borrow about 36 cents for every dollar we spend. And when I was in college in the 70s, I was taught by my professors, many of whom were of the Keynesian persuasion, that we really didn't have to worry about the federal debt because, after all, we owe it to ourselves. The people on this side of the room save a lot. They buy government bonds. The people on this side of the room get government benefits. And it all kind of comes out, even it's all within the family. It's not within the family anymore. Half of the federal debt is held overseas. Half of the federal debt is held overseas, much of it by Japan, and for bizarre reasons by China, which is still, despite its remarkable growth, a lot less prosperous country than we are. And so it's a great deal. They lend us a lot of money. We buy their goods. They don't charge us much interest. And it's great as long as it goes. But nobody in their right mind thinks this is going to last. Nobody thinks it's going to last. I mean, you have to wonder, why are the Chinese still buying U.S. securities anyways? I mean, do they sit there in Beijing and look at Washington and say, man, those Americans really know how to run a government? Do they look at our financial system and say, boy, I'm glad we took their advice. Look what a great job they're running their financial system. No, they look at the world and they say, we'd really rather not have so much money in the U.S., but what are the alternatives? Japan? Japan is a declining society, shrinking population, stagnant for a year, now in an active campaign to cheapen their currency. It's just not a place that you think of investing for the future. Europe can't even decide if it wants to have a currency, for gosh sakes. I mean, the one thing we basically agree on, with the possible exception of a few people in Texas, is we still want to use the US dollar. So I think the Chinese look at the world and say, there's no place better to put our money for now. The United States is the world's tallest midget. But this is not going to last. And pretending that it's going to last, which is actually the official policy of the US government, if you look at what they're doing and not what they're saying, is really imprudent. And here's just one way to measure it. The federal government, even though interest rates are very low, spends about 6% of the budget on interest now. The president's last budget, we'll get a new one in a couple of weeks, but the president's last budget says, if the economy does as well as I predict over the next 5 years, and presidents always think the economy is going to do great over the next 5 years, and if Congress took every single suggestion on spending and taxes that the president made, interest in 5 years would go from 6% of federal spending to 12%. Why? Because rates will rise as the economy gets better, and because we're borrowing more and more every day. We're like the consumer who isn't even making the minimum monthly payment on the credit card. And the point is, you can say that the world will end if we don't reduce the deficit, and you will probably be right, but you have a really hard time putting a date on the date that the world ends. It's not very convincing. I think a much more convincing argument is this. On the current trajectory, our government will do about 3 things. It'll be a giant health and welfare and retirement fund, mainly for elderly people. It'll have a few tanks and missiles and battleships. And it'll be paying interest on the federal debt, half of it going overseas. And absolutely everything else is getting squeezed. And that's what's going on right now. The pressure in Washington, the deficit reduction that they've done on the spending side, has all been concentrated on that slice of federal spending, discretionary spending, defense and non-defense discretionary spending, the annually appropriated stuff, in which every single thing we do to invest in the future is included. That all the pressure on spending is in that narrow slice of spending, roughly about 15%, that if there's anything you think of as an investment, whether it's R&D, education, infrastructure, and that is a recipe for a declining society. Okay, so that was about 15 minutes. That's all you need to know about the federal budget. Why are the people in Washington so thick? Why is it so obvious to everybody else what has to happen? Why is it so difficult for the members of Congress and the president to take Ben Bernanke's advice, which is basically ease up on all this short-term austerity because the economy can't take it now, and let's deal with the long-term problem and deal with it now so we get all the benefits in the future and maybe some confidence-building benefits that we have in the present? Well, I think there are a number of reasons. One reason is the political polarization that some earlier speakers have mentioned. It's not just a myth. The political system is far more divided in almost every respect than it has been for some time in our history. Some of this is the way they draw congressional districts, but some of it is the way America is. If you look at these maps of congressional districts and counties, how they divide in voting, you see a pulling apart. Americans tend more than ever to live with people who have incomes like them and who share their views. So we get a Congress that reflects that. Some districts are safely right, some districts are safely left. Members of Congress are concerned not about getting ousted by a member of the other party, so they don't have no incentive to move to the center. Instead, they're worried about primaried from somebody from one of the left or right wings, depending if you're a Democrat or Republican, and they act accordingly. That's not an easy problem to solve. I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens out here when we have congressional districts drawn by commission, but some of this is not just the gerrymandering, it's the real thing. The second thing is, and this was mentioned in the tax reform conversation, it's kind of hard to understand, but we don't seem to have the characters in Congress who can rise above the fray and get things done. The people who can yell at each other on the floor of the Senate and then go off to a quiet room and figure out, okay, what are your priorities, what are my priorities? And how, is there some place where we meet? I mean, has there ever been a more pathetic example of how to fail negotiations than John Boehner and Barack Obama? I mean, each of them seems determined to put the other guy in a corner that he can't get out of and then blame him for the alternative outcome. I mean, sooner or later, we have to get to some point where people who fundamentally disagree find some common ground to do the people's business. The country is basically divided between these two camps, and they have managed to fight themselves to a draw. We have evolved the worst hybrid of a presidential and parliamentary system. The majority can't get anything done because the minority has a way to stop it, particularly in the Senate, and the minority can't move the majority. So you have this charade in Congress now. The third thing, and I don't think you can escape it, is money in politics does play a big role in this. Partly because the members of Congress spend an increasing fraction of their time raising money instead of legislating or doing the people's business. And secondly, because money does, there's not a one-to-one relationship, but it does influence these outcomes. There's a reason why it's been so hard for Zeke and his compadres to get competitive bidding in durable metal equipment for Medicare. The people who make their money for not having bidding are very effective lobbyists in Washington. Even in the fiscal cliff bill, which was relatively clean by Washington standards, which is to say it was only dirty, not really dirty, there was provisions put in by Harry Reid for some Medicare providers who were not happy about decisions that CMS had made. So it does make a difference. But finally, there are some issues in our society that make this difficult. And here I want to call on the wisdom of Doug Elmendorf, who's the director of the Congressional Budget Office, and as far as I know has never either been a student or a faculty member at Stanford, but I hope it's okay to quote him anyways. The Congressional Budget Office is an amazing institution. It's one of the few institutions in Washington that actually works the way it was designed to work. It gives relatively clear and unbiased advice to members of Congress and the public about the choices we face. Not about what choice to make, but about the choices we face. And Doug has two lines which I think sum up the problem very succinctly. The first is there's a fundamental disconnect between the benefits Americans want from their government, particularly for the elderly, and the revenues they're willing to send to Washington. There's a fundamental disconnect between the benefits the people want and the revenues they're willing to send to Washington. And that accounts for a big part of our deficit. And that's really hard for politicians to deal with. Politicians are very good at sensing the public mood. We are not going to have a rally in Washington that brings 1 million people waving signs, raise my taxes, cut my benefits. There was a sign up here earlier which kind of shocked me. It was, give me, what was it, liberty, not debt. I was a little, that's a Tea Party t-shirt, and I was a little worried that it would still be up here when I spoke. So thank you for taking it down before I got here. The second thing Doug says, and he made this point really eloquently in a recent speech, is putting the federal debt on a sustainable course will ultimately require increases in taxes or cuts in benefits for people who currently consider themselves members of the middle class. The middle class is going to contribute to this if we're going to fix it, in higher taxes and lower benefits. That is not a sentence you hear very often in Washington, certainly not from people who have been reelected. It seems to be more common in people who lose their seat and then decide to tell the truth. So we are faced with a dilemma. We have this luxury of not dealing with this problem now. Congress is notoriously bad at dealing today with long-term problems, whether they're fiscal, whether they're climate change. We know that's a problem. The incentives are all screwed up. They worry about the next election. You don't get reelected by proposing a fix to a problem that's not going to hit for 10 years. Don't believe me, ask George H.W. Bush, who raised taxes and lost his job. So what happens? Well, we're either going to get a crisis, perhaps an artificial crisis like the fiscal cliff or the sequester, but that mechanism doesn't seem to have worked very well. They're very good at creating artificial crises, and then they evade them. Maybe we'll get a financial crisis, but as Mohammed told us this morning, we don't really know when and whether that's going to arrive in our lifetime. So counting on a financial crisis to solve your problems doesn't seem like a great strategy. So if it's not a crisis, then what? An outbreak of leadership. I'm not sure that's very likely either. Let me stop there, and I'm happy to take questions on this, on what it's really like to work for Rupert Murdoch. And if you're really good, I asked Mohammed by email the question that Glenn Hubbard raised, which is the more likely outcome, the bad scenario that we all die or the good scenario we're all rich? And if you ask really good questions, I'll read you the answer that he emailed me from the car. Thank you. Thank you. That's it.
Normally I start by asking you a question, but I agree 100% with absolutely everything you said. So I'm going to ask you guys 2 questions. First question is, raise your hand. How many of you approve of our Congress, our legislative branch? How many approve of the job they're doing? I know this is not an unbiased group of citizens, but polls show that 8 to 9% of Americans approve of the job Congress is doing. So there's literally no one willing to raise their hand? Okay, how many of you last November voted for an incumbent? Okay, I think that,
well done.
Yeah, I'm not blaming any one person who raised their hand. But I
yes,
think
he is.
But I think that is the problem. Everybody thinks my congressman's doing a great job, but the other 434 suck. I'm sorry, are doing a bad job. Okay, questions from the floor. And again, you need to get the mic right here.
So while the mic comes, we love those polls, we in the press, because no matter how bad the press falls in those confidence polls, we're always one notch above Congress. It's very reassuring.
Not to mention economists.
David, I have a question, and that is, to what extent might this attitude in Washington be generational based? That is, we boomers grew up in great prosperity. The generation coming behind us grew up with Nixon and Carter. We can't even work together, and we have very different spending habits. Do you see any change along generational lines?
That's a good question. My initial reaction is there's probably a lot of stuff going on generationally, but that doesn't explain this. After all, it wasn't so long ago, it was just in the 90s when we managed to have some significant legislation passed that reduced the deficit. And so that's 20 years, but it's not, or even less than 20 years. I think that there is a big issue in the size of the baby boom generation and the general sense of entitlement that comes with it. And when you are a big generation and you are promised a lot of benefits and you vote, you tend to get what you want from politicians. And so one really interesting dynamic, I think, will be whether the younger generation, whether they actually vote and whether they realize that the longer we wait to deal with our long-term deficit problems, the worse it's going to be for them. I think you see some of that creeping up. You see it much more on climate change than you do on fiscal issues, but there is some chance that they will become a force to be reckoned with, because there's now a lot of people who are under age 45, which is the beginning of the baby boom, and some of them actually vote.
Yeah, basically, I'll be really quick. David Walker spoke here, John, 4 or 5 years ago, and he's formed a company that's Come Back to America, or Come Back America, and I'm on their email list, and I get their emails, and they're very, very thoughtful about these issues. And I'm extremely frustrated with this. I have sent those emails, occasionally when they're really good, to about 20-something and 30-something kids I know who I have relationships with and who I respect, and I think they respect me, and not one of them has ever responded or shown an interest. Not one. I mean, the 20-something and 30-something kids aren't paying any attention to this. They don't care. They don't get it. Okay, next question. Sorry.
After lunch, it was a great accomplishment.
Gerhard, your mic isn't on, but I'll repeat the question if it doesn't work. He just complimented me in case you couldn't hear him.
You said money matters, and I certainly agree with you. And part of the problem seems to be that, as distinguished from China and Russia, we have legalized corruption. They have a lot of corruption. We don't at the federal level because we have just legalized it. Now, is there any, given the Supreme Court in Buckley and given the Supreme Court in Citizen United, is there any way you see we can solve the money problem in Washington?
I think the short answer is no, and that's kind of discouraging. I mean, I should hasten to add, I actually believe in democracy. Sometimes my faith is shaken a little bit. That's what happens when you work in Washington. But basically, I have some confidence that there will be, at some point, a backlash against this money. I'm no expert on the Supreme Court decisions, but the decisions so far seem to make it very difficult to control it. And we all in the press believe that disclosure and transparency is a good thing, and we hope it will be sufficient. And there's a lot of places where in the current political system it's not transparent. And so there I think we have some reason to be hopeful. The Federal Trade Commission or the Federal Communications Commission, I can't remember which, is now in the process of requiring if you have a sponsored tweet, you have to signal that it's sponsored, you know, like hashtag ad or something like that. The president is setting up this organizing outfit called OFA, Organizing for America or something like that. It's basically the continuing campaign. He was going to take corporate money. There was some backlash, and it went, he decided not to do it. The next thing will be, will we be able to force them to release the names of their donors? So there's, on that there will be, but other than that, I'm not very optimistic, and it's a problem.
David, you mentioned an issue before that I don't think it's a lot of attention, but it's sort of the issue of gerrymandering in congressional districts and making a lot of safe districts on both the far left and the far right. And that's creating a certain set of incentives for members of Congress just not to even deal with people across the aisle. And I look at that and I say, without changing that in some way, shape, or form, it's going to be hard to change congressional behavior. And I was just wanted to mention an idea and get your thoughts on it. What would you think about shrinking number of districts down from 435 to say 150, make the districts bigger and make them more inclusive of people of different parts of the political spectrum? Would that have a positive impact on that dynamic?
Well, it's not going to happen, so so let me say, you're going to get Congress to pass a law that says that 335 of you are not going to have a job. I'm not sure that that would do it because, and here's the question, so what about the Senate? What accounts for the Senate? There's no gerrymandering in the Senate except that which was done when we founded the country. And there are two things that we observe. One is that some of the people who came from the House to the Senate have brought this kind of vitriol with them, this notion that, I mean, it's remarkable. Compromise is seen as weakness in Washington. That's a bit of a problem for a legislative system that was created by our founders to force compromise. And the second thing is that that doesn't explain the kind of absence of giants of the Senate. The people who, and they're of all parties, Bob Dole, George Mitchell, Packwood, Teddy Kennedy. That doesn't explain the absence of people who can somehow have that personal characteristic that makes for great political leaders, to get a whole lot of people who don't agree to say, oh, come on, guys, we can do this. Now, I should say, because I don't want you all to be completely depressed leaving here, that's why a lot of us are so interested in what happens with immigration reform. All right, two things about immigration reform. One is both parties have decided it's in their interest to do it. It's hard to win the White House if you piss off all the Hispanics in America because there's too many of them. And secondly, in the Senate, there are a bunch of Republicans and Democrats who don't usually get along trying to pull this thing together. And that, if that happens, it might help rebuild some of the trust that we know is essential to get stuff done. And I think that kind of thing is much more likely to make a difference than changing the dimensions of the districts, which might solve some problems, but doesn't solve others.
Don't worry about depressing us, because the next session is on Europe. So.
Well, I always tell people when I have doubts about democracy, I either go to one or two places, California or Europe. And then I feel better about Washington.
Actually, it's the gentleman in the back in the blue shirt.
Thank you. You mentioned the growing polarization in Washington, and I wanted to know, to what extent do you think that this is maybe caused by, both sides of the aisle, a pull from both directions apart, or, maybe whether it's actually more of a unidirectional thing? Basically, your opinion on whether or not the polarization is due to, both parties, or maybe not.
Right, right. Or, and then I thought you were going to say, and isn't it the media's fault? So I answer that too. Well, look, it's obvious that there has been a great deal of polarization. If you look at it there's fewer and fewer bills that have support from both parties. That if you draw a mountain represents the modal vote of each party, there used to be this substantial overlap. There were liberal Republicans from the Northeast and conservative Democrats from the South, and that's pulled apart. I think it is true that the Republican Party in Congress has moved farther to the right than the Democrats, but the Democrats are no great heroes either in this thing. I think, and you can see that in some of the debates over the budget. I mean, the president has actually said some things that to deal with entitlements, the president is in favor of changing the cost of living adjustment for Social Security benefits, using it, what he says is a more correct but a cheaper adjustment, would save $130 billion over 10 years. And I mentioned this to a Republican senator, and he said, yeah, have you noticed that never shows up on any of the bills on the deficit that the Democrats put in? But I definitely think, and Norm Ornstein and Tom Mann have a good book on this, that there has been a big problem with the move of some Republicans to fight for principle and hope that you can get eventually win the next election, win the next election, win the next election, so why compromise now? You'll lose your base. And you can see some worries among establishment Republicans about whether that's costing them elections. Because it turns out if you nominate people who seem to be misogynistic, they don't tend to get a lot of votes from women. Let me respond to the question you didn't ask real briefly. Is it the media's fault? In my view, it is not the media's fault, but we make it worse. That too many of my colleagues have discovered that the way to fame and fortune and high salaries is not to give people like you some facts and let you make the political choices, but instead to start with the choices and then build a case around them. So if you watch MSNBC, you get one set of conclusions about the federal budget and a set of facts that support those. If you watch Fox, a different set of conclusions about the federal budget and Fox that support those. And if you're one of the 15 people in America who watch both channels, you must be very confused. But what if that's the way to make money in our business? What if the way to make profits, is to kind of go one way to the other? And we walk that walk every day. The news reporters at the Wall Street Journal do not want to be the conservative alternative to a liberal New York Times. And we worry that the economics of the business will point us in that direction, and that what we went into the business, people of my generation, to do, which was to be fair and balanced in what the words used to mean, that will not be a survivable thing. And you can see that with CNN every day.
This gentleman here who almost got called on last time.
Mitt Romney unfortunately made a statement during the election that at this point only 50% of the population is paying federal taxes. To what extent is that an inevitable tipping point? Demographics of the the baby boomers is going to push that strongly in that direction. And so, notwithstanding your comments, there's really nothing we can do to prevent heading in the direction of Greece, which I think is in the 65% or so range.
Well, first of all, that wasn't exactly how Romney phrased it, as I recall. He didn't give you the technical fact, as Len Berman did, about the fraction of people who pay income taxes. He said that there were givers and takers. And it also turns out if you tell 47% of the American people that they're takers, that they don't tend to vote for you. So, well, look, but there are a couple of things here which you said. First of all, it is true that about half the households in America don't pay income taxes. It's not true that they don't pay taxes. A lot of people who are in the other half do pay payroll taxes. So it's not but there is a substantial fraction of people, I can't remember the number right off my head, who are exempt from the income tax system, in part because we've chosen to do our anti-poverty stuff through the tax system. And as I think Len said earlier, that poses a problem because they don't really feel like they're contributing members of society. And so thinking about some change in the tax system, which I don't think is going to happen anytime soon, but this notion of a consumption tax with a high-end income tax does make a lot of sense. Secondly, can we drop the Greece metaphors? We are not Greece. We are not going to become Greece in the foreseeable or even the unforeseeable future. Greece was an economy which didn't work, which lied and cheated its way into the Eurozone, and which is basically bankrupt, and they're just waiting. Europe's trying to find a way to declare it. We are a big economy. We make most of what we consume, and we consume most of what we make, despite our trade things, and we print the world's reserve currency. So I think when you tell people we're going to become Greece, their eyes glaze over because they know it's not true. The question is, how do we prevent becoming a little bit too much like Spain and Italy, which don't have the luxury of borrowing at low rates because the world doesn't trust them? How do we avoid becoming the UK, managing its slow decline into the Atlantic and apparently running an austerity program that seems designed to make their debt to GDP worse? So there are role models out there that we want to avoid, but I think the Greece thing is so extreme that it doesn't help illuminate the choices we have.
Okay, should we give Mohammed the last word?
Oh, yeah, Mohammed, the last word. So I write Mohammed, and give me a minute, I got to get on here. And I ask him, okay, so if you're at the fork on the road, what are the odds that you'll be on the bad fork and the, I don't want to raise your expectations here, what are the odds you're going to be on the bad fork or the good fork? And I'm having trouble getting the email up. Hold on a minute. He basically says that it's all about timing. He very cleverly refuses to answer the question I've posed, which is why he makes so much more money than I do. He says, read your question, a quick BlackBerry response from the car on the way to the airport. I had asked him, that fork in the road, as Glenn put it, where we're either all dead or we're either all rich, what's the odds? Here's what he said. The time element is very important. Specifically, if the timing of the fork were to be accelerated by a big geopolitical shock out of the Middle East or North Korea or something, or a serious political breakdown in Europe, then the probability of the less favorable outcome would be uncomfortably high. If, however, the timing is prolonged, then the ongoing process of endogenous U.S. economic healing would significantly improve the probability distribution.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.